With that, I recognize Mr. Davidson, the gentleman from Ohio, for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Chairman. I think our witnesses, I think it's fitting that we ended on just how many strings are attached to this money, which is one of the big problems. But let me not bypass the fundamental problem. Perhaps the most essential piece of infrastructure our federal government has is our money, our supply of money. We think of everything in dollars currently. And, we used to be constrained by how much tax revenue we raised. If we were going to spend more money than we had, we'd have to say, well, we have to find a way to pay for it. And then, in the early 2000s, there was this idea that Reagan-proved deficits don't matter. Dick Cheney said that. It was false. At least, though, you were constrained in that model by how much money somebody would lend you. And really, since the 08-09 financial crisis, America's currency's been backed by nothing, not even the amount of money people will lend us. And so when you think about the Federal Reserve, their balance sheet has grown from less than $1 trillion to $9 trillion. So what is that doing? It's undermining the value of all of our money, and it is massively growing economic disparity. It is massively growing the wealth gap, and it is creating an architecture that pits us against one another. And often the solution is we need more government. Well, the more government costs more money. And unless there's some remedy to put discipline in our monetary system, it grows us further apart. So I think we really need to look at that most basic piece of infrastructure for our economy, the United States dollar, and the way that the fiscal policy that we do grows that gap, not just because we spend the money, but how we're doing it. So we have to have some discipline in it. It's clearly not there right now, and that'll be a big change. We can't go there overnight, but let's think about the biggest piece of infrastructure in the United States goes back to Dwight Eisenhower. The interstate highway system, and at that point in time, the federal government had just funded a massive war in World War II. And Dwight Eisenhower realized he couldn't have guns and butter. We were in a Cold War with the Soviet Union, so we had to defend the United States of America, but there was a priority to repay the debt that was accumulated after World War II. In fact, the whole global monetary system had just been restated at the end of World War II. And rather than blow fiscal discipline out and just spend whatever it took to build the interstate highway system, there was some discipline of how are we going to pay for this. The next thing about that project and true infrastructure is, how are we going to pay that? The infrastructure actually generates some sort of return for the American economy. And unfortunately, so much of this most recent infrastructure bill violates those principles. Not only isn't it well paid for, not only is it not covered with taxes or lending, it grows the wealth gap by destroying our money. It has a better effect for China's economy in some areas than America's. Why? Because China dominates electric vehicles, components like batteries, and they dominate the rare earth mineral system. And so when you look at the supply chain crisis, it pushes us to import more from China. Rather to make investments in the United States, it makes it harder to generate the electricity we need while adding more demands on electricity in the United States. So it's problematic. It's great for the Green New Deal, folks. It moves the ball towards that agenda, but that agenda is, if not on purpose, certainly a consequence is it's better for China than it is for America's economy. And you say, well, that's a near-term pain, and in the long run, it's going to work out. But let's think about what it does at the ports. Our country needs to improve its infrastructure if we're going to compete in the international economy. We have too many failing bridges, low-quality roads, crumbling locks and dams, outdated cargo ports, and these have led to an enormous supply chain backlog that's harming every business in this country. California's shipping container backlog has been a visual reminder of our supply chain crisis. The $1.2 trillion infrastructure spending bill passed mostly by Democrats includes $17 billion for port infrastructure. And of that $17 billion, about $2.6 billion is specifically earmarked for defraying the cost of upgrading equipment at America's ports. But this money can only be used for human-operated equipment. It's a gift to the labor unions that operate the ports. Automated ports can unload cargo ships nearly twice as fast as human-operated machines, but this bill prevents investment in equipment that we know would help solve the supply chain crisis. This is just one example, and we've highlighted so many other ones. I would prefer that we make it easier to invest in America, and that's the way that we ease the burden at the ports. But even when we're going to make the investments at the ports, we don't do it in the most efficient way. We do it with political motives. It's a shame that we've seen that happen, and it's a shame that we continually do this to our money supply with the way money is spent here. With that, I yield.